Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here. Welcome to episode 2 of History's Weirdest Tortures, where I look at some of the more unusual methods that humans have devised for inflicting pain on one another. The problem with researching this stuff is sometimes I just find a picture and I can't find much more information about it. This one, for example, it's a woodcut illustration from the front of a book, rather snappily titled The Liar, or a contradiction to those who in the titles of their books affirm them to be true when they were false, although mine are all true, yet I term them lies. It was written in 1641 by the water poet John Taylor. I can't locate any scans of the book's contents or find any reproductions. So unless I want to spend a few grand on one of the 6 copies in existence, I don't suppose I'll ever get to read the contents. So I don't know if this torture device was based on a real piece of equipment or if it existed only in the fevered imagination of John Taylor. But if it did exist, it's a pretty devious invention. The liar, whoever that is, sits atop a very uncomfortable looking roller whilst balancing heavy weights on his hands and feet. These weights are attached to a great row of spikes above his head. The torture comes from maintaining this painful position whilst remaining balanced on the roller and keeping the weights up. Any slight shift would cause the victim to bring the spikes down upon himself. But as I say, does this torture exist? I'm not sure. And speaking of tortures that might not exist, those of you who have seen the movie The Cell, there's one scene in particular that you'll probably remember involving someone having their intestines slowly wound out of their body on a spindle. This scene always creeped me out, but being the uneducated pleb that I am, I never knew that it was based on the martyrdom of Erasmus of Formia, also known as Saint Elmo. Erasmus was a 3rd century Italian bishop who was persecuted for being Christian. He was eventually imprisoned and tortured to death. The final torture, according to legend, was to have his belly slit open and his intestines slowly pulled from his body by winding them around a windlass. As you can probably imagine with a story that's nearly 2,000 years old, it's pretty hard to verify if this really is how he died. Some have speculated that, as he was a patron saint of sailors, his association with a ship's capstan might have somewhere along the way got combined with the story of his martyrdom, and that's why we have this image of his intestines being wound around a windlass like the ropes on a ship. Then again, I wouldn't put it past the Romans to actually kill someone in that way. And history has other stories of people having their entrails slowly wound out of their body. One of the most famous and gruesome examples I've heard of happened in Keelerville, New York, at a location that is known today as the Torture Tree. It occurred in 1779 during the American Revolutionary War. Seneca Indians and British Loyalists had joined forces in western New York to fight the Continental Army's advance across Native American land. General John Sullivan led about 3,500 men into western New York with the intention of driving out the Seneca Indians. On the 12th of September, General Sullivan ordered Lieutenant Thomas Boyd to take a 23-man scouting party into Seneca territory to discover the location of one of their villages. The following day they were ambushed and surrounded. 15 of Boyd's men were killed in the ensuing battle. 8 managed to escape, whilst Lieutenant Thomas Boyd and Sergeant Michael Parker were captured. Boyd and Parker were taken to the town where Keelerville stands today. Back then it was a Seneca stronghold known as Genesee Castle. What followed was an extremely long and brutal torture session. Boyd and Parker had their finger and toenails torn out. Their genitals were mutilated and their backs were flayed. Both men had their right eyes pulled out and left hanging down their cheek. Their nose, ears and tongue were also cut off. The worst part of their ordeal was still to come though. They were led to the torture tree and their bellies were sliced open. Then one end of each man's intestine was pulled from their belly and nailed to the tree. The men were then forced to run in circles around the tree, wrapping their guts around the trunk slowly, excruciatingly pulling it from the bodies. When the men finally collapsed on the ground from exhaustion, the Indians cut the hearts from their chests and beheaded them. The torture tree still stands today, as does a memorial stone dedicated to Boyd and Parker. And it's not just the Seneca Indians that used this particular torture. An ordinance from 15th century Oberursel, a town in Germany, states that whoever is caught stripping off a standing tree, mercy would have been more beneficial to him than the law is, for when the law is fulfilled, then one is to cut up his stomach at the navel and pull out a length of the gut. The gut is to be nailed to the tree, and one is to keep going around that tree with the person so long as he still has any part of the gut left in his body. It's an extremely cruel execution, almost as cruel as Gaunching. Gaunching has been written about by many explorers who travelled across the Mediterranean region in the 17th century. The Gaunching scaffold looks a lot like your standard gallows, except there is a sharp metal hook instead of a noose. The prisoners' hands are bound behind their backs, then they're pulled up by a rope and pulley until they're suspended high above the hook. The rope is suddenly released and the prisoner falls down onto the hook, impaling themselves. Another variation of this torture was for the hooks to be built halfway up on the walls of a castle or a city. The prisoners would be thrown off the walls from above. The worst aspect of this execution is its unpredictable nature. The victim never knows how long their ordeal will last. Depending on how they fall and where the hook impales them, they might get a mercifully short death, or they might hang there for days writhing in torment. Joseph Pitton de Tournefort, in his book A Voyage into the Levant, writes about Gaunching victims. He says, "Sometimes they will live 2 to 3 days and will ask for a pipe of tobacco while their comrades are cursing and blaspheming like devils." A bashaw was passing by one of these places in Candia. An offender that was hanging on the gaunch calls out to him with a sneer, "Good, my lord, since you are so charitable according to your law, be so kind as to shoot me through the head to put an end to this tragedy." At a time where other forms of torture and execution were commonplace, gaunching was considered to be so barbaric that very few prisoners were actually submitted to it. And finally, I'm going to look at 2 weird Japanese tortures. The first one is known as ishidaki, which translates as stone holding. Apparently it originated in the Edo period, so somewhere between the 17th and 19th century. Or at least that's what the internet tells me, although when you're researching Japanese torture methods it tends to bring up a whole load of very strange anime, so sometimes it's difficult to find accurate historical information amongst all the weird fetish art. The torture consisted of 2 parts. First, the victim is made to kneel on a board made of sharp wooden triangular wedges. The weight of their body forces their shins down onto the wedges, which starts to cut into their flesh. For most people this would be torture enough, but then weights are placed on their thighs. These Izu Stones weigh about 45 kilograms each. They are slowly stacked on top of the victim's legs, and then they're tied in place so that they can't fall off. Soon the wooden wedges slice through the victim's flesh until it hits their shin bones. Sometimes an interrogator will increase their agony by rocking the Izu Stones from side to side, deepening the cuts in their flesh. As you can imagine, damaged joints and broken bones are a common side effect of this torture, as is permanent nerve damage and circulation problems. Many who were tortured this way were never able to walk again. The second weird Japanese torture is called Sarushi. I think I'm saying that right. It translates as hole hanging. In the mid-16th century, Portuguese missionaries started travelling to the port city of Nagasaki in Japan, and Christianity began to spread across the region. By the start of the 17th century, this rapid growth of Christianity was seen as a threat to the central government. In 1614, a complete ban on Christianity was declared. Any Christians had to renounce their faith or leave the country. Those who refused to do either were tortured using the whole hanging technique. The method is quite simple but devious. The victim is suspended upside down and a cut is made across their forehead. This will stop pressure from building up as blood rushes to their head, meaning that they'll remain conscious for longer. They're then lowered down into a pit. Usually the pit has a lid so that the victim is suspended in complete darkness. Often the bottom of the pit is filled with excrement so that they'll be constantly tormented by the stench and the flies. The prisoner is left in this way, suspended upside down until they renounce their faith. Those that didn't renounce would hang there until they died, but their death wouldn't come quickly. The interrogators had a doctor on hand who could notice if the prisoner was near death. They'd then nurse them back to life before hanging them in the pit once more. There are many accounts of Christian martyrs dying in the hanging pits, but probably the most extreme example is that of Magdalene of Nagasaki. In 1634, at the age of 22, Magdalene of Nagasaki voluntarily handed herself in to the authorities, refusing to renounce her faith. She was imprisoned and numerous attempts were made to break her spirit. First, she was subjected to the water cure, forced to swallow great quantities of water and then made to vomit it back up. They then pushed bamboo slivers under her fingernails and made her claw and scratch at the ground. Still, she wouldn't renounce her faith, so they took her to the town square and suspended her upside down with her head in a pit filled with rotting animal organs and excrement. For 13.5 days she hung there. Her torture only ended when there was a severe rainstorm and the pit filled with water, so she drowned. If it wasn't for that, who knows how long she would have held out. So, thank you for watching this video, and I hope you found it interesting. There's been a lot of Christian martyrs in this episode, and that's not for any particular reason, it's just what came up as I was researching this stuff. Maybe next episode I'll look at some of the Sikh martyrs, because if you thought the Christian stuff was brutal, just wait until you hear that. But until then, thanks for tuning in. Big thanks to everyone who's supporting the channel, it's much appreciated. Thank you to all of you. And here's some more videos you might enjoy. Until next time, goodbye.